Howdy, folks. Good morning. Welcome to the June 2026 edition of Cattle Trails Showcase. I'm Ron Wilson, glad to be your host. The purpose of the Cattle Trails Showcase is to continually highlight the community's historical elements, museums, and other attractions along the historic cattle trails. And Lonnie Stephen is our showcase chair. The Cattle Trails Showcase was initiated 4 years ago by the International Chisholm Trail Association. Now it's a project of the Historic Cattle Trails Consortium, which seeks to promote all the historic cattle trails: Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, also known as Great Western Trail, Shawnee, and the Goodnight Loving Trails. We've been talking about the fact that the second annual National Cattle Trails Conference is going to take place in Sedalia, Missouri on October 22 to 24 this fall. And I'm excited to report that the website historiccattletrails.com now has that complete schedule online, and you can order tickets for the conference as of now. So yes, you can go to historiccattletrails.com, look at the program, and get tickets ordered for the conference. We look for it to be a terrific conference. Next month is 4th of July, culmination of the America 250 celebration. Again, we want to commend Congressman Ron Estes of Kansas and Congressman Lloyd Doggett of Texas, who co-sponsored the congressional resolution honoring the history of the cowboy and the historic cattle trails as part of America 250. We had a wonderful time with Congressman Estes recently, presented him an award. He presented us a copy of the resolution from the congressional record, and we're really pleased that we could honor the history of the cowboy and the cattle trails in that way. So we've talked about the trails, many trails, the Shawnee, Chisholm, and Western trail systems. But what about before that? What was happening on this continent in terms of cattle movement before those trails that we've talked about today, that we've talked about before? So today, we're going to learn about how Texas cattle supplied the demand for beef in Louisiana, in California, and even back into the 1700s. Our presenter is our own Michael Grauer. He's president of the Western Cattle Trail Association, vice president of the International Chisholm Trail Association, now an independent Western art and history consultant based in Kansas City. Michael, we look forward to your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate you all giving me some time today. I'm in Branson, Missouri, so it turns out our connection is somewhat intermittent, so just be patient. Maybe we can get back on. You know, when the grandkids call, you answer the call, and that's what you do, is you go see them. So I'm not in my usual surroundings, so I hope you'll bear with me if we have any glitches. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's okay, sir.
Please do, and we can hear you and see you very well.
Good. So far, yeah.
I can't read it.
Right in reverse.
We might remind everybody to please mute before Michael starts.
So I broached this topic with Lonnie and Ron and some others, some months back, and it's something I've been banging the drum about since we started the Historic Cattle Trails Consortium, is what happened before the famous cattle drives after the American Civil War. And I think it's especially important right now with the semi-quincentennial of happening and how these, as Ron said, the demand for beef cattle and especially hides and tallow as well, really helped build this great country long before even the American Revolution, but certainly were critical to the American Revolution. So I'm going to give you a sort of a sketch, let's call it today, a sketch of those cattle trail systems that existed long before they trailed cattle north. And there are a couple of books, one of which was They Headed Them East First, which is a pretty important book that was recommended to me by Gary and Margaret Kreisinger some years ago. It's really done the most work on the trails that went west out to California, and also to the extraction mines in Colorado and Idaho, was J. Evans Haley. Mr. Haley published a couple of diaries from which I'm going to read today One was Michael Erskine, who went out to California in 1849, and then another from 1854 when that cattle market was starting to wane, but nevertheless picked back up with the discovery of gold and silver in Colorado, and then later on into Idaho and so on. You may recall the John Wayne movie called The Cowboys, where he loses his entire cow crew to a gold fever up in his herd to Belfouche, South Dakota. So it's really hard for us to grasp. Well, maybe not so hard. I don't know, because there are those people who get crazed certain things, get rich quick, and I think we need to be aware of that push and pull, and especially the demand and the supply. And the supply was always in southern Texas and northern Mexico, and that's what drives what I'm going to tell you today. So I'm going to give you a sketch. Not claiming I'm a scholar on this. This is something that's been of interest to me the last couple of years, and the credit really goes to others who have worked on the trails into Louisiana, and especially J. Evetts Haley. I would encourage you, if you're ever out in Midland, Texas, to go see the brand new Haley Archives and Library. It's by far one of the best in the on the range cattle industry you'll find anywhere. Brand new building just opened this year, and really geared towards scholars on the range cattle industry. So be aware that there are other sites to visit. And I think he might be the director out there, Pat McDaniel, will be a great program on Cattle Trail Showcase at some point. He's really a great presenter. So let's put him on the docket. Anyway, just to put us in context, of course, introduction of horses in 1519, followed by the introduction of cattle in Americas in 1521. And then the tradition that came out of North Africa traveled to Spain and then across the Atlantic to land roughly where in the Panuco Valley near Veracruz, Mexico, and then expanded north up into what we know as Texas today. But that was all New Spain, and that's really important to remember. And this is a watercolor we had at the National Cowboy Museum that we acquired while I was there. It's one of the earliest known images of vaqueros roping cattle by German artist named Johann Rohundus. Just a little bit of a reminder of what those traditions were that moved up into Texas. And we'll talk about that as we go forward. There's also an influx of herding techniques that came from the British Isles that came way through the Atlantic coast. It does not get to Texas until the 1820s. It is into somewhat in Louisiana, but really the Spanish influence is far greater. But this is a wonderful painting. One of the earliest images I know of, 1856, of a cowboy, and in this case at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art there in Kansas City, thirsty drover. And you can see the drove in the background is really quite small. And so keep in mind that the herds that I'm talking about, the droves that I'm going to talk about today, are relatively small in terms of the great trail drives that would happen later on. A few hundred head initially, then anywhere or 1,000 to 1,500 was a pretty good size herd for what I'm talking about today. But the Camino Real de los Tejas, as you can see, roughly established by 1690, all the way to what's today Western Louisiana, and the border between French Louisiana and Spanish Texas was very much in dispute. And so for a while, the Texas extended on the east side of the Sabine River, at least claimed by the Spanish. And the Camino Reals, as you can see, there are multiple routes that make their way to Natchitoches, Louisiana, and basically just west of there is a place to talk about in just a minute. But really, these were immigration trails and also supply routes, because Spanish law forbade any Spanish citizen from trading with any other entity but Spain. And so when you got as far as you got from Mexico City or even Chihuahua in western Mexico, you were still obligated to trade with those two ports. And so people on the frontera, as they called it, were very limited on the things they could trade or obtain. And so there was a great market or a great black market system of contraband, and livestock was very much part of that. Cattle, horses, and mules. over into Louisiana. But we have to really start here by the 1690s, and we don't really think about the cattle industry in the United States that early, but it's fully established by 1690 with the establishment of 6 East Texas missions. They didn't last very long, but they were raising cattle there and pushing them in small droves over into French Louisiana, certainly by 1700. And that's pretty important to understand. Now, as I mentioned before, that border between French Louisiana and Spanish Texas was somewhat in dispute, and eventually in 1717, but only for a couple of years, there was first a mission and then a presidio established. The way the Spanish system worked is a mission was established to convert the local native people to Catholicism, and not usually very far away, a couple of miles away, was usually a military presidio to protect the mission and especially the farming and ranching that was basically self-sustaining in those regions. So Los Adayes, and you can see both spellings. One, and it borrows its name from a Native American group called the Adayes. Established in 1717, they were driven out just a couple of years later, and then it was reestablished in 1721. It became the official Spanish capital of Texas not long after that, last a little over 50 years. And this is actually the embarkation point for the Texas cattle industry is Los Adayes. A little bit east of there is Natchitoches, Louisiana, but that was France. And so we have to remember when we think about the map of the United States, New Spain extended all over Canada, and we don't remember that, and then it follows the Mississippi River in terms of Spanish claim. Everything east of the Mississippi was in the lower part, the southeastern part of the United States, was largely claimed by France, and then there was that tug of war between France and Great Britain. That also particular mission and this particular presidio are critical to the understanding of that trade that went to supply beef cattle first to Natchitoches, then down further south, and ultimately to New Orleans. So there are Spanish vaqueros who are driving cattle, and I'll read a quote here. There's a fairly new book by Professor of Galvan came out, Los Adayes, the first capital of Spanish Texas, and then another recent book about contraband trade in the livestock industry and other things came out just in the last few years. So I encourage you to look into those sources. So I'm going to read this quote. All of the original 6 East Texas missions provided a foundation on which ranch operations began in Spanish Texas, together with mission ranches at San Antonio and La Bahia. La Bahia is Goliad, and you can see on this. Jumped ahead there for a minute. Goliad is down closer to the coast, about southeast of San Antonio. There was a mission La Bahia was established there, and we know it today by the town of Goliad. Those are the 2 other sites that were the centers for livestock industry in Spanish Texas. And so we need to keep that in mind. Now move forward in time. Spain, Bernardo de Galvez, who was a prominent military official and ultimately a governor of Texas, and related to other officials named Galvez, for which the island of Galveston is named, led Spanish troops east out of Spanish Texas into Louisiana and fought a series of battles all the way across, all the way as far east as Pensacola, as you can see. And so in August of 1779, that began. Texas vaqueros gathered up cattle to drive them east, first into Louisiana and then further east into Mobile and Pensacola, as you can see by this map. It's pretty fascinating stuff. In other words, our cattle industry played a critical and direct role in the freedom of the United States from British hegemony, and that's really important. However, just to keep it in context, I'm going to read one more quote from Professor Galvan's book on Los Adayes. In 1751, Spanish vaqueros drove livestock from Spanish Texas into Louisiana, and these cattle drives eastward anticipated much larger ones to come from South Texas during the American Revolution. And we think that at least 10,000 head of cattle were driven from Texas. And I'm going to read another quote. This is from a book about the Texas connection with the American Revolution. Spanish Texas cattlemen and their vaqueros trailed these Texas cattle. Soldiers from Bejar, San Antonio, La Bahia, which is Goliad, El Fuerte de Cibolo, escorted the herds. In other words, soldiers were escorts that were not herds necessarily. Several hundred head of horses were also set along for cavalry and artillery purposes. This is during the Revolution now. Extant records even indicate that a few soldiers from Texas were recruited to fight with Galvez's army. That's pretty fascinating stuff, I think, when we think about the Spanish role in the American Revolution. But beef cattle were critical to that because everyone knows an army moves on its stomach, and that's important to remember. And so through the American Southeast, Spanish troops, Spanish vaqueros are driving Texas cattle into there. Now, this is a well-known image of a Spanish soldier, soldado de cuera. In other words, he wears leather. That's what they called them. I think this is often mistaken as a vaquero. It was rare that a Spanish soldier did this kind of work because they were soldiers first. And so oftentimes these presidios would hire local vaqueros to help with tending the herds. And the herds are pretty small, a couple hundred at a time. Into Louisiana, they hired extra vaqueros with a military escort led by a person who may have been dressed like this. And so I think we need to be really careful about early image of what a cowboy looked like. And this one, I think, is erroneously supposed to look like a cowboy, and I don't think that's true. This is a soldier. And we need to remember this is a presidial soldier. I threw that in there just for context. Now, I mentioned before La Bahia or Goliad. This is another part of that trailing system into Louisiana. And we need to also remember that France gives Louisiana, the entire Louisiana territory, or forfeits it to Spain in 1762. So, and even though things happen officially far away, in local terms, there wasn't that much recognition of Spanish rule by the French who were still in Louisiana. So we need to be aware of that. So eventually there comes to be known as a road called the Opelousas Road, or the Lower Road from La Bahia, which heads up, as you can see, northeast through northeast through southeast Texas until it crosses over the Sabine into Louisiana. And it's known by various names depending on what of the border you're standing. Opelousas in Louisiana, Atascosito in Spain or Mexico. But the critical thing, and I highlighted it, it was called the Opelousas Road in the 19th century when it was used as a cattle trail. And that's really important. This is a cattle trail. Much like the Shawnee Sedalia Trail was a cattle trail going north, it was an immigrant trail called the Texas Road coming south. It was the same place on its particular use. So we need to keep that in mind. So this is pretty fascinating. And it's one of the roots of that Camino Real. And we want to think it's one superhighway when we're thinking about historic trails. It's always a system. No matter what, it's always a system. Here's a better idea of the Atascosito Road. And this is a little more fill-in from the Handbook of Texas Online, which is very, very important. But you can see where it heads over into Louisiana, various places. Now you can see they've come a little bit further south from Natchitoches, and they're getting closer and closer to Louisiana. But again, I highlighted, emphasized, after the development of the cattle industry in Texas, the old Atascosito Road was followed by drovers from South Texas to New Orleans. So eventually they're driving directly to New Orleans, not initially, but eventually. And the cattle trade out of Texas had a great outlet going out of New Orleans and eventually to Galveston too, where those Texas cattle left on ships, went around through the Gulf, around Florida, up to the East Coast. That's a big part of the story that we need to be telling is cattle on boats. Not only did they get to the New World on boats, but they left to become part of the market on boats too. This is also true out in California, which we'll get to in just a minute. So that And also barges and ferries to get them across the Mississippi River are also critical. And then cattle going north during the American Revolution to supply even George Rogers Clark's troops in Indiana and Illinois in the what was called the Old Northwest. We don't think about all that stuff, but movement of cattle by way of a different kind of trail, which might have been of water, is something else I think we need to look at as cattle trail historians. So this is it's kind of a dim map, and I wish I could show you a little bit better, but it's if you look at Crockett, Texas over there to the left, and you see the line that's drawn through it, Opelousas Trail, that's really and remember, they wander all over the place. So as I mentioned before, these cattle were driven in the 1750s and up to 1779, 2,000 head of cattle from San Antonio to New Orleans by way of that Opelousas Trail. So there is a whole system from East Texas that comes to be known as the Beef Trail or the Beef Road. We know that that was usually the way these trails were referred to was roads, not trails. That's a more modern usage. And so even on the King Ranch, Captain King always talked about the cattle roads that came out of King Ranch when he establishes that. So I think vernacular is important, and so we can understand how broad this was thought of. Here's just an historical marker I threw in. Texas recognizes this. One of the Texas Historical Commission's historical markers, and really it's critical that these trails are marked wherever they are to look at a bigger and grander picture of cattle trails history. It's really, really vital that we recognize that. So early images of cattle drives in Texas that we immediately presume, certainly by 1867, were certainly showing Texas cowboys going north on the Shawnee Trail or a little bit later on the Chisholm Trail system or the Western Trail system, when in fact this particular image, if you look very closely at the drovers, they're all wearing sombreros. Now, most drovers back in the day wore sombreros, but these are actually cattle who are about to cross the Sabine or actually are crossing the Sabine River going into Louisiana. So this is one of the best known early images from 1867. And in fact, this is a scene of the trail drives going east. So we need, again, we need to remember the context. It's really easy today with the availability of images online. We need to be careful how we use them. And so this is really important, and it's actually historian Byron Price who clued me into this one. So there are many people who are working on this, and we need to be listening to them. So out in California, there was a very robust ranching industry, certainly left over from Spanish California after 1846, when California becomes part of the U.S. That tradition. Now, this is an 1875 painting, but it's something of a nostalgic holdover of how those vaqueros looked. And if we compare this to that Rohingyas that I showed you that was painted 40 years before that, you can see the similarities. But that cattle industry was relatively small in terms of the supply that was in South Texas. So beginning in 1848. Now I have 49 on here because that's really when it becomes established, but certainly as early as 1848, cattle were being driven on this trail that's on the map. Now I borrowed this map from the Butterfield Overland Trail map because the Butterfield Trail followed the cattle trail and also became known as the Southern Immigrant Trail. Remember what I said about the Texas Road and the Shawnee Trail? It was also carried immigrant traffic as well. And I kind of cut off the map just a little bit. I cropped it a little bit so you can get a better idea of where they traveled, usually in one form or another to El Paso del Norte, across southwestern New Mexico, over to Tucson, and they crossed the Gila River where it met the Colorado River at Yuma, because there was something called the Yuma route during the 49ers exodus in the late 1840s. They first went to Warner's Ranch, which was near San Diego, and then drove those cattle up. Now I'm going to read you an excerpt from a great book, and I'm going to hold this. I don't know if you can see this because it's not on the screen. It's the Diary of Michael Erskine, who drove a herd of cattle and eventually established residence in California. Now this is published by J. Evetts Haley. And these books are kind of rare, but I want to read you something about the Texas-California Trail. Quote, of all the cattle trails that trace their lasting lines across the face of America, that from Texas to California was the longest and the worst, the hardest of all on horses, men, and cattle. Nor was life upon any of those that fanned out from Texas remembered for being easy. Had it been, it is doubtful they would have been remembered hardly at all. That's a pretty profound quote from Mr. Haley. You know, he's such a great historian. And I want to read one other thing. While the trail driving of Texas cattle had not yet achieved the efficient technique that characterized its most active period following the war between the states, the trailing to uncertain markets had been underway since Texas was a province of Spain and Mexico. So that puts it firmly in context to help us understand really where all this begins. You know, Spanish Texas, of course, is the critical one. So Erskine trails about a little over 1,000 head of cattle. He documents every day in his journal, and that's what's published in this diary of Michael Erskine. We have so few of these trail driving diaries. That's why it's so critical to be familiar with these, because they just didn't take notes like this. So I don't want to read just one little section. Now this is they're actually in the Trans-Pecos area when he reads this. So it's May 26th, 1849. And the way they talked and wrote back in those days, we have to remember that's the vernacular from the day. So for example, they called the stampede a stompede. That's just how they talk. So, quote, the cattle stampeded last night about 9 o'clock, run about a mile and a half, got them quiet and herded them there all night. Lost none. Some oxen went back 8 miles. So remember, I'm just going to do a paraphrase. One of the things on the trail drives out of Texas is nearly always the cattle would turn back towards home. And so it was a big fight for the first few weeks to keep them headed north or east or west or north, because they just want to go home. And so these oxen that went back 8 miles, they were just trying to go home. Mr. Maney took the trail and found them. He is a first-rate hand. I wish all was like him. This morning, John, Mike, Jet, and Shelton came up with a yoke of oxen which John purchased. Did not find the lost mule. Brought up the bay horse which Hampton stole. Mr. Gage, the particulars of this you will learn through Mr. Gage, who has taken much interest in our welfare, who returned from the Sabinal on account of ill health, apprehended him in Castroville, and got the horse, saddle, bridle, and the 6-shooter back. He sent them after us and was met by John. John brought up a yoke of cattle. This is something else that we need to remember when we're reading the immigrant diaries from the immigrant trails, Oregon, California, and so on, and even the Santa Fe. They don't make usually a distinction between draft animals and beef cattle. So they call them all cattle. So that's something I don't know that anybody really has parsed out. How many of these were oxen and how many of these were beef cattle or even dairy cattle? So in any case, that's just one diary. Here's a bigger map. So that's the overall overland trail, which has recently been recognized as a National Historic Trail, 1857. So 10 years before that, they're driving cattle along that trail. Now, on the map, it shows Abilene, Texas. Really, San Antonio was where most of these trail drives started. So because I've really struggled to find, I've seen it one time, and then, of course, it's one of those things you find it once, you never can find it again. I've not been able to find a really good map of the Texas-California Trail. But you can see the route that it took, and it was grim going. It was tough. And they really got to Southern California with most of their herd intact, about 800 head by the time they got there. So they lost about 200 on the way. Now, this is where I talked about where they follow the Gila River, and then where it meets the Colorado coming down from northern Arizona. Crossing the Gila and the Colorado was always treacherous, and also because there were less than welcome people on the other side. So we'll just put it that way. So that was always a struggle. And just again to reminder where we're talking about, this is that Texas-California Trail. So they were feeding miners. miners are, completely obsessed with extraction. There was a wonderful artist named Charles Christian Nall who established himself out in California and became, in many ways, the chronicler of that industry. And you can see this is Sunday morning in the mines, and these miners are doing what they're doing, but they're ultimately they have to eat. And so beef cattle were very welcome. And it was very much like the old saw. You could buy a cow in Texas for $4 and sell it for 40 in Abilene, Kansas. It was pretty much the same thing. But by 1854, the market had dropped, and it had dropped out. So it lasted about 5 years, but a critical 5 years. The other thing about Nall is he does a great job in chronicling, along with James Walker, that Spanish vaquero industry. These paintings are fabulous. I'm showing that in this case called the Fandango, celebrations on the Spanish haciendas. But most importantly, he does show us scenes like this. And so I think that these artists need to be brought into our conversation more and more often, because you can see, techniques may not be exactly accurate as we know them today. But remember, this man's built a loop out of a rawhide reata. And if anybody's ever tried to throw a hemp rope or a grass rope, they're quite a bit heavier than the poly ropes everybody uses today. So, I mean, these are really critical in our understanding of that cattle industry, and also the trail drives out of Texas into California. There were also cattle that were driven on what's called the Cherokee Trail. Now, most of them came out of Texas and then followed this Cherokee Trail, which you can see out of Tahlequah, Oklahoma, out to Fort Bridger. Now, they did make stops on Cherry Creek, which is now Denver, of course, and then found their way up into Idaho. This is a little bit later, and certainly by the early 1860s, there are Texas cattle still going west by way of trails like the Cherokee and also the Goodnight Loving, which could be getting, when it gets up into Colorado, actually bends to the west to supply the miners in Colorado and Idaho. So this is the best I could do in finding this. I'm not good enough to draw these maps, but as you can see, they intersect with the not only the Santa Fe Trail, but also with the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails too. So that's part of this story as well. Now, this is a little hard to see, but it does include the Texas-California Trail, as you can see, bending up over to the west. It's a wonderful map from 1876, and this, of course, is a reproduction and has little sketches, little historical legends down in the lower left corner. But it's really critical. But the thing it leaves out, there's no evidence of the old beef trail going into Louisiana. So we have to turn to popular culture. This is where we learn about cattle trails, is from the Lone Ranger's Western Treasury comic book, 1953. I was so happy that I stumbled across this, and it has other important historical references in this comic book on the Western stock saddle, cowboy clothes, brands and branding, for those of you who are keeping track for your bibliographies. But the important thing is the map that's also provided. I think it's actually on the back cover. And here's a detail of that map. And look at this. Isn't this fascinating? Because it not only shows the old beef trail and following the old Atascosa and Opelousas trail, but and also the Opelousas trail going to New Orleans. Look at that right there. And then, of course, the Texas. Somehow the Texas-California trail starts up in Decatur, Texas. I guess that's because those rodeo stars all live there now, and the bull riders from Brazil, they all live there. So in any case, I think it's a fascinating key, and it's wonderful because it's all part of popular culture, trying to teach our youth about these trail systems in a different kind of way. I mean, I think it's just absolutely fascinating that this appeared in a kid's comic book. And we know the Lone Ranger started his career as an old drover out of Texas before he turned to law enforcement. But nevertheless, this is a critical biographical resource for those of you who are keeping notes there at home. So when we see images like this that appear in 1874 about the Texas cattle trade, this is one of my favorite things to show, because if you'll notice in the middle three panels, the very top one, that's supposed to be a mill of cattle that was restored to some order after a stampede. There must be 25, 30,000 head in that one particular mill. There are so many cows in there. And so these artists were going out. Who knows if they even witnessed any of this stuff? And I do show some of these images and other images from these French artists who came out west. and on what they believed the cattle industry looked like. And so, of course, going east, going west, they are, of course, crossing rivers, which is the most dangerous part of any cattle drive. Not the stampede necessarily, and certainly not fights with other people, but it was crossing rivers. And of course, getting out on the plains where there was no water. Not so much on the old beef trail going east, but certainly going west on the Texas California trail. The want for water was absolutely profound. So some of these images do fit the narrative that we believe, the mythology that we've come to believe. But I think it's also important to remember that they did point them east first, and then they pointed them west before they ever went north. Thank you very much. Much obliged.
Outstanding, Michael. Fascinating. Whole nother perspective on the cattle drives and the cattle industry. One thing I wanted to ask, I've been told that beef was not the predominant source of protein in those early days. I mean, people in the East were eating pork and lamb, I suppose, and
Yes.
what. So the but there was some demand for beef, obviously. Was and you mentioned early on hides, tallow, bones.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah, the
so
primary industry for Spain was hides and tallow, and their recollections after reminiscences, where they talk about simply using what's called a hawking blade, killing those beef cattle, cutting their hamstrings, severing their spinal cord, stripping the hide off, and leaving the carcass to rot, or the carcass is then rendered for tallow because there was no ways to preserve the beef. They did jerk some of the beef, but it's such a laborious process most of it spoiled before they could do that. And I really appreciate you asking me this because I mentioned before the cattle industry on boats, on ships from California, out in California, and also in Mexico proper. There was a huge market in the Pacific for not only hides and tallow, but especially for jerked beef to serve sailing ships. And Hawaii becomes a big part of the beef cattle industry. And that's why we eventually have Hawaiian cowboys out there called pañolos, and pañolo is a bastardization of Espanol because, and eventually those Spanish cowboys teach Hawaiians how to herd cattle, and so their gear and their uses are a little bit different. But it really starts with jerked beef in barrels, salted barrels that are used to serve sailing ships that would stop in Hawaii and continue on west, what we call the east, into Asia. And so there's a huge market to the west out of California that served Hawaii and the Pacific. And likewise, going east across the Atlantic, hides, tallow, not so much jerk beef because it was so hard. They tried all kinds of different ways to do that to preserve it. But it's ironic how similar that story is to the decimation of the American bison because the demand was for the hide and some parts of the tongues, for example, but there was no way to preserve the meat, and so they left the carcasses to rot. That's exactly figured that out on how to preserve the beef a better way. Does that answer your question?
absolutely, Gary.
Hey, Michael, I have a question. Um, to start with, that was a fascinating presentation, and thank you very much for that. That was really super. Richard Henry Dana's book, famous book, 2 Years Before the Mast, he talks about the hide trade in California. They sailed out of New England, they sailed around, I'm sure you read the book, and
Yeah.
they did the hide trading in California. You alluded to that a minute ago.
Yeah.
My curiosity is, don't know if there's an answer for it or not, but my curiosity is, were those cattle hides that the New Englanders were trading for on the West Coast by ship? Were they the ones from Texas? Do you think? Do you think
Yeah.
they were a result of those drives you were talking about?
Some of them definitely. Some of them definitely. Yeah. Yeah. As I said, the cattle industry in California was much smaller in those days, and it kind of goes a little like this. It's firmly established in Texas by 1720. It's about 1760 when the missions and presidios along the California coast that we're familiar with from the pictures of the historic sites That's when that's established. And so it's very much subsistence for the longest time, but the market is still hides and tallow. Absolutely. And so, as you say, the demand for leather was an international trade system. So as much as it's an American story, it's really an international story. It always has been. I mean, it really is. And again, like Jimmy between supply and it's and that Cordoban leather and getting them to the tanners in New England and so on that met that international demand. So it's still going on. Frankly, it still is.
Freezing.
Right.
We lost some of that, Michael. I did want to note that in the chat, Chris has suggested the book "The Texas Connection with the American Revolution," and so that looks like a really interesting source that would tell us more about this time frame. And
my connection is so bad. Did you ask me a question?
no, I was referring to the chat. There's another point in the chat. Check out our website for our June 16th Zoom program presented by Richard McCaslin on Spanish help supplies, including cattle with defeating the British on Gulf Coast during the American Revolution. If you can put in a link for that or a place to connect with that, Philip, that would be great. Assume that's Fort Worth Westerners or Bob. Any other comments or questions for Michael? You got to watch out for those stompedes.
I think need to be inserted here. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
We just need to realize that Paul Nowak did extensive research on that trail over into New Orleans and the La Bahia Trail, and he spent several years on that. He died suddenly and was unable to publish his work, but his work has been transferred. All his notebooks and research and interviews has been transferred to the University of Texas at Austin. So if anybody wants to really get in and research the trails, that specific trail, the east, particularly to New Orleans, that's where they are. They're housed at the University of Texas.
Thank you, Margaret. I couldn't remember his name. I mentioned the title of the book that you and Gary recommended, but I forgot his name. So I thank you for that clarification.
Other comments or questions for Michael? Not seeing any. Michael, thanks again for a really fascinating, really interesting program. A whole nother element, whole nother dimension than we've known about before. So big virtual round of applause and thank yous to Michael. Lonnie, what's coming up next on Cattle Trails Showcase?
Well, we go to July, and Michael might have to help me with the last name. B.B. Hudspeth
That's
has
correct.
an extensive collection of Gunsmoke memorabilia and also Kansas heritage collection. And he has arranged with the different communities, I think 7 so far in Kansas, almost a year-long tour with these artifacts. And they will, I think, start in January and end in November of next year. So he's going to tell us more about where and how his collection came about and why. And his artifacts are more of the modern movie type, I think, but it should be real interesting.
Should be interesting. So, as always, it's the second Friday of the month. So, it would be Friday, July 10. So, we hope to see you then. With that, until next time, this is Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate, saying thanks for taking time to join us in this place, and we'll see you next month on Cattle Trails Showcase. Happy trails, everyone.
Hey, Ron, I told Dennis and you guys, I got a